Hello, it's Supernatural Sammy here. Today, I'll be telling you about strange things children experienced while missing. The first story is about a boy named Austin Engstrom. Austin lived in Kolsva, Sweden with his parents. While walking home from school with a friend from class, the two decided to go to the friend's house to play. Around 3:30 p.m., Austin started his walk back home alone. His house was not far from the friend's, and he had taken this trip countless times before, but Austin didn't come home. His parents sent his brother Gustav out to look for him. Gustav talked to Austin's friend that he was with that afternoon, and the friend told him Austin left at 3:30 and should have been home hours ago. Gustav searched for his brother and found nothing, so he went back home to tell his parents. When he got there, Austin was sitting on the couch with his parents, scared and shivering. He told his parents and brother he took a different route home, through the woods, and then strange things began to happen. He said, suddenly the bright day turned dark, and animals began scurrying out from the bushes and trees. He looked up, expecting storm clouds, but the sky was still clear. Then a sulphurous-like smell filled the air, and he looked up to the sky again. He saw 3 hovering objects above him. They were gray and made no sound. He said they were close enough he could have hit them with a stone. They had 2 dark lines on them and were pulsing like they were breathing. He noticed another 2 objects in the distance, floating over the trees. They were darker gray and larger than the ones right above him. He said the next thing he knew, he woke up at night, laying in the road, cold and confused. It was unnaturally quiet, and he could see a light disappearing into the sky. He then walked home to his parents. Austin was later interviewed by 2 ufologists. He told them he couldn't figure out where he had been for 4.5 hours, and his brother had checked the part of the road where he had woken up and didn't see him. He told them his parents were extremely mad, saying he was lying, and sent him right to bed that night. He then developed a fever and was stuck in bed for 4 days. He told the men how the objects moved like octopuses through water, pulsing at the same time gracefully, and seemed to change direction with this pulsing. Austin has thought about this event many times, wondering what happened to him that night. Next is Lillian Carney. 6-year-old Lillian was picking blueberries with her parents one afternoon at the Mullen Bog in Maine on August 8, 1897, when she suddenly disappeared. There was a huge search effort involving over 200 people. The search lasted until midnight. No trace of Lillian was found. Tuesday morning, the search party grew to 300 to search for the girl. About 10 a.m. Tuesday morning, a man named Mr. Bert Pollard found Lillian about 2 or 3 miles from the spot she went missing. She seemed to be perfectly fine, was holding some berries, and asked for her mom. Her parents asked her what happened, and she described being in a place where the sun had shone the entire time she was missing. She said she heard people talking the first day she was missing, presumably the search party. Afraid, she stayed quiet. She also claimed to see what she called little things, the size of her cat, scurrying around her. She clapped her hands to scare them away. These were assumed to be rabbits, but you'd think a 6-year-old would recognize a rabbit. Strange how she said the sun was constantly shining even though the weather had been partly cloudy that day. She was in a thick forest far from town, and she was missing for 46 hours, so she was out there overnight. What was that bright light Lillian saw? The next case is a really weird one. It happened in the 1960s. The story revolves around a witness's father, who was 9 at the time, and was playing with a friend named Gabriel in his fenced-off backyard of his house in Ethiopia. He said his dad and Gabriel were from the top 1% of Ethiopia's ruling elite, and Gabriel's father was a 4-star general of Ethiopia. He says he turned around for 1 second, and when he turned back, Gabriel had disappeared. Very strange, because there were 10-foot brick walls and armed guards patrolling outside. Gabriel could not be found. There was a nationwide search, but no trace of him was found until exactly 6 months later, when he was discovered in the same backyard, wearing the same clothes he had vanished in. His private school uniform, a white shirt, and brown pants. Gabriel appeared dazed and confused and thought only a few hours had passed. They asked him where he was, and he claimed that he had been taken on a trip with 2 nice men to a glowing white room. There he met children from different countries. He said he was surprised the 2 men that looked white were able to speak Ethiopian perfectly, and that he could understand all the children there even though they were all from different countries. He described a glowing white room with no windows and doors that would vanish into the walls. Buttons were on the walls, and if pressed, beds would come out. Then he was in a city that was clean and glowing with flying cars and people that looked like us but different. He said a man took him to one of the tall buildings where he was to stay. The building had an entertainment room he could use. He said the room could travel to different places like the woods or the beach, and that the room itself could fly. After a few hours, he was taken back to his yard in Ethiopia, thinking just a few hours had passed. Most adults did not believe him, or thought he had been possessed by the devil. Later, Gabriel went on to get a doctorate in physics and is believed to be working in Holland. Next case, a man tells about a strange experience he had when he was a child. He wants to remain anonymous. He says when this happened, he lived with a foster family in a rural area in the Midwest. Near his house was a trail him and his foster brother liked to bike and walk on together. The 2 knew the trail and area really well and went out for a walk one day in the summer. You could clearly see a clearing where people would camp by the lake. It was about a mile away from the house. He and his brother went to the lake often to catch frogs. It was a bright sunny day in July, and while on the trail, he began to hear a distant clicking sound. The sound continued to get louder until it was uncomfortably loud, but strangely, his brother couldn't hear it. His brother started to carve into a tree. He urged his brother to leave, but his brother insisted on finishing his carving. So he stepped no more than 20 paces from his brother when he felt his foot go through something, so he looked down. When he looked back up, his surroundings completely changed. He was in a huge, cold, unrecognizable forest with 0 sound. His brother was gone. Terrified, he started to scream and run. After running a while, he felt the weird feeling on his foot and stumbled. When he looked up, he was back in the forest he knew and could hear his family calling him. His family said that they had been looking for him for hours. He told them what happened, but they didn't believe him. He also said he had a burnt rubber smell on him he couldn't get rid of for days. This last account happened to a girl from Romania in the 1980s. She also didn't give her name. She recounts a strange incident that occurred when she was 4 years old in the Romanian mountain village of Vatra Dori. She describes having a nice day with her grandparents, exploring the village, when she suddenly became hesitant about entering a particular shop. She couldn't understand why, but she really didn't want to go inside. Her grandparents continued to pull her into the shop when she said that she was a dog now and dogs weren't allowed inside. She held tightly onto a nearby lamp pole and pretended to be a dog, barking and panting. Her grandparents were not happy, but told her to stay where she was, and they went inside. The next thing she remembers is waking up to a slowly growing sense of awareness, finding herself walking down a side road with a bridge behind her, a river to her right, and a rocky slope to the left, with the woods looming over the street. Said the shop was over 500 meters behind her, and there were no people around. She felt a strong sense of being completely alone, and noticed there was no sound, no birds, not even the creek could be heard. She couldn't even hear herself moving, and felt her mind was completely clear and working perfectly. She said since then, she's never reached that level of clearness and concentrated logic. Taking a few steps on the street, she looked down at her feet and could see 6 long shadows moving in every direction. She wondered where the light was coming from to make so many shadows. Looking up, she saw no sun or moon, just dim sky. She thought about how strange this was and closed her eyes, thinking about holding on to the pole. She then felt her grandma grab her shoulders, asking her where she went and why she wandered away. To her, it only felt like a few minutes had gone by. But her grandparents had gotten a small search party together to look for her and couldn't find her anywhere. She told her grandparents what she saw. They didn't say anything. After this, she was ill for 3 days with fever and diarrhea. The doctor said it was food poisoning, but she said they all ate the same food and she was the only one who got sick. The family never went back to that shop or town again. This is a bonus story. So this is actually something that happened to me. I didn't go missing, but me, my mom, and my friend had a really weird experience. There's a few similarities to these other kids' stories, so I thought maybe I'd add this in. When I was 15, my friend and I went with my parents on a trip to my dad's friend's house in New Jersey for a barbecue. It was a nice warm sunny day, and we decided to explore the nearby train tracks. Carol, the lady that owned the house, told us about a trail that led to some train tracks right by our house. So we decided to go for a walk. The walk started off normal, but then it started to get weird. As we approached the train tracks, the atmosphere changed. We couldn't hear the birds or insects anymore, and the air felt heavy. Our footsteps sounded muffled, and everything had a subtle greenish tint. When we reached the tracks, we took some rocks and hit them against the metal, and the sound was off. The best way I could describe it is it sounded like it was kind of dull. It just didn't sound right. We continued walking a little bit along the tracks, and then my mom took out a penny and put it on the tracks. So we put some rocks in a little pile so that we could come back and find it later. Then we walked back to the house. When we got back, we told Carol that we went to the tracks. She looked really confused, like we hadn't been gone long enough. I wish I had checked the time before we left, but we had to have been gone at least a half hour. It took about 15 to 20 minutes to get to the tracks, and we were walking pretty slow. So before we left, that evening we went back to find the penny. While we were walking, everything seemed normal. It didn't feel like it did before. There was no weird tint. The sound wasn't weird. We could hear the birds and the insects. We got to the spot where the penny was, and it wasn't there. It's possible that the train came through and pushed it maybe where we couldn't find it. We all talked about it later and pretty much had the same experience with the sound and the weird color and the weird atmosphere. And I just wanted to mention it because in these other kids' stories, the sudden lack of sound in the woods, there's always sound in the woods, so when it suddenly stops, it really feels weird. So, what happened to these kids? Did they just make up these stories? Or maybe they fell asleep and dreamt these strange experiences. It's weird that when people were looking for them, they couldn't find them, and then later, they were found in an area that was searched. They seemed to just suddenly reappear. Let me know what you think about these strange stories in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and as always, thank you so much for watching.